In Marion, Indiana, the story isn't told from the sky, it's told from the streets. Block by block, factory by factory. You can still see the rise and fall of a city that once powered America. On one side of town, General Motors still roars, the last giant standing. But across the city, the old RCA plant looms in silence. Its dark windows staring back like a monument to everything Marion used to be. Between these two places is the truth of what the city gained and everything it lost. Welcome back. We're in Grant County today, right in the middle of Indiana, between Fort Wayne and Indianapolis, to perform an autopsy on a city built by a gas boom and left behind by the global market. Marion once peaked at nearly 40,000 residents, and today that number has fallen by almost a third. And the fallout isn't just in the data, it's visible on every corner. This city was built on industry, stamping plants, glass factories, cable production, auto parts, and televisions that filled living rooms across the country. Rail lines fed the factories, neighborhoods grew around them, and downtown reflected the confidence of a place that expected tomorrow to be bigger than today. But when the plants closed, the impact didn't stay behind the factory gates. It spread into the storefronts, the neighborhoods, and the census numbers that show a community fighting to hold on. So today we're analyzing Marion through our 10 pillars of decline, from the survivor at GM, to the ghost at RCA, to the scar left behind by Dana. I'm Alan, and today we're going there, doing that in Marion, Indiana. Moving from the industrial core to the historical downtown, and then deep into the residential blocks to see the human cost of the collapse. No sugarcoating, just a raw reality from the ground up. And to understand how Marion rose, how it began to fall, we have to start with the last giant still standing. Out on the west side of town, behind long stretches of steel and concrete, sits a factory that once defined the rhythm of this city. This is the General Motors Metal Center, and for nearly 70 years it has been the beating heart of Marion's industrial identity. In 1956, the horizon on Marion's west side changed forever. This was the era of the Great Compression, a time when American manufacturing wasn't just an industry, it was a social contract. When General Motors opened the Fisher Body division here at 2400 West 2nd Street, they weren't just building a 2.7 million square foot stamping plant. They were building a middle class. GM didn't choose Marion by accident. In the early 1950s, as America's auto industry exploded, Detroit needed a massive stamping plant to feed its growing network of assembly lines. Marion had what GM wanted: rail access, flat land, and a workforce hardened by decades of glass making and heavy industry. Construction began in 1954, and by 1956, the Marion Metal Center opened its doors. What they built here wasn't small. This became one of the most important stamping facilities in the entire GM system. If you drove a Chevrolet, a Buick, or a Pontiac, or an Oldsmobile in the second half of the 20th century, chances are the doors, fenders, or quarter panels were born right here in Marion. For decades, this was the heartbeat. 3 shifts, thousands of workers, skilled trades passed from one generation to the next. The whistle of shift change wasn't just a sound, it was the pulse of the city. Paychecks from this building built homes in the Northway and West Point additions, filled storefronts downtown, and sent kids to college. This factory was a physical manifestation of Pillar 1 industrial history that felt permanent. But history has a way of hollowing out even the strongest foundations. As the 20th century closed, the gas boom wealth that founded Marion was long gone, and the global market began to claw at the edges of the city. While other giants like RCA and Dana began to stumble, this plant became a survivor. It navigated automation, the 1980s downturn, the 2009 bankruptcy, and a wave of closures that wiped. And in 2022, when many cities were losing their last industrial lifelines, GM did something unexpected. It doubled down on Marion, investing nearly $500 million to modernize the plant for the next generation of electric vehicles. In a city full of ghosts, this is the survivor. Today, the GM Metal Center is a rare bridge between the Marion that was and the Marion that is. It remains one of the largest stamping plants in the world, the last titan standing in a city where titans once ruled every corner. But as we move east, we leave the roar of the machines behind and enter the silence of what happens when the anchor finally breaks. But the story of Marion isn't just about what survived, it's about what didn't. Because just a few miles east of GM's roar, the sound cuts out. The machines fall silent, and the scale of what was lost becomes impossible to ignore. If GM is the last giant standing, then what we're driving towards next is a giant that fell the hardest. The roar of the stamping presses is a sound of survival, but as we move just 4 miles south, that rhythm disappears. We're entering a part of the city where the industrial heartbeat didn't just slow down, it stopped. This is where the story shifts from the survivor to the ghost. This is 3301 South Adams Street, and to a stranger, it's a 1.2 million square foot carcass of brick and glass. But to the people of Marion, this was the television capital of the world. If GM was the anchor of the West Side, RCA was the soul of the South. RCA arrived in the 1940s. By the 1950s, this plant was the global epicenter of color picture tube production. At its peak, more than 8,000 people worked here, a city within a city, running 24 hours a day to keep up with the world suddenly seeing itself in color. For decades, entire neighborhoods lived by the shift changes at this gate, but the social contract that held at GM didn't hold here. In 1987, RCA was sold to a French company, Thomas. Then came the 1990s, the rise of flat screens, and the brutal math of global competition. In 2004, the line stopped, the lights went out. Overnight, nearly 1,000 jobs vanished, and the south side of Marion entered a decline it has never fully escaped. The closure didn't just eliminate jobs, it erased an identity. Storefronts emptied, property values collapsed, and the south side of Marion has been fighting uphill ever since. Today, the RCA plant stands as one of the most haunting industrial ruins in the Midwest. It goes so large it casts a shadow across the entire city. When you stand at these gates, you don't hear the hum of a global leader. You hear the silence of a city that lost its primary identity. If you appreciate this kind of ground-level storytelling, consider subscribing. It helps me keep documenting places like Marion with honesty and respect. Leaving the ghost of RCA behind, you don't just leave a factory, you leave the shadow of a giant. But the story of Marion's collapse doesn't end with what still stands. Because just a few minutes north, there's a different kind of wound. Not a massive ruin towering over a city, but an absence, a scar. RCA was the fall you could see. Dana was the fall you could feel. This empty expanse of concrete is all that remains of the Dana Corporation. For nearly 80 years, this was one of the most important and best paying employers in Grant County. At one point, rivaling even GM in its prime. This wasn't just a factory, it was a cornerstone of Marion's economic foundation. Dana arrived here in the 1930s, specializing in the precision manufacturing of drive shafts and axle components. If you worked here, you had made it. The Marion plant became part of a national network that kept America's trucks, tractors, and industrial equipment moving. For decades, it was steady, predictable, a place where a worker could build a life. But as global competition intensified in the 1980s and 90s, Dana began restructuring. Automation increased, contracts shift, and the Marion plant, once a dependable pillar, found itself squeezed between rising costs and shrinking margins. After years of layoffs and a 2006 bankruptcy filing, the The doors finally closed for good in 2013. A year later, the building was demolished, leaving behind nothing but this 25-acre scar. Where thousands once worked, there is now an open wound in the landscape. No towering structure, no haunting shell, just absence. This is the physical manifestation of Pillar 10. When a plant like Dana disappears, it doesn't just leave a hole in the ground, it leaves a hole in the community. The property values of the surrounding homes are tethered to this concrete. When the jobs left, the investment left with them. Dana's fall didn't echo like RCA's, it faded, but the impact was just as real. In the Industrial Autopsy of Marion, the survivor at GM shows us the hope, the ghost of RCA shows us the loss, but the scar at Dana shows us the permanence of the decline. And now, as we leave these industrial zones behind, we head towards the center of town to see how the loss gravity reshaped the heart of the city. Leaving the empty concrete of Miller Avenue behind, you don't just leave a demolition factory, you leave the physical evidence of a middle-class life that vanished. GM showed us what survived, RCA showed us what collapsed, Dana showed us what was erased. And now, as we move towards the center of Marion, we see what happens when the industrial gravity that once held this city together disappears, because downtown is where the impact becomes impossible to ignore. This is the center of the autopsy, Grant County Courthouse, completed in 1895. It is the crown jewel of Pillar 5 architecture. It was built with the confidence of a city that had just struck gas gold. During the Indiana gas boom, Marion was a town of millionaires, and they built a downtown to match that status. Hotels, theaters, banks, and grand commercial blocks like the Marion National Bank building rose around this square, creating a skyline that rivaled cities twice its size. Downtown wasn't just a business district, it was a trophy room of a booming industrial city. For nearly a century, this square was the beating heart of civic life. Rail lines brought shoppers in, factory paychecks kept the registers ringing, and you could buy a suit, catch a movie, or grab dinner after a shift at RCA or Dana. Downtown was the commercial engine of this region, a place built on confidence and momentum. But decline is a chain reaction. When RCA downsized, foot traffic dropped. When Dana closed, storefronts emptied. When the gas belt wealth finally faded, buildings that once symbolized prosperity became reminders of a city fighting to hold on. Today, downtown Marion is a mix of resilience and vacancy. The bones of the old city are still here. The architecture, the street grid, the courthouse that refuses to surrender its place to the skyline. But the economic engine that once fed these blocks is gone. And without that gravity, downtown has struggled to find its footing. This is Pillar 4, Pillar 6, and Pillar 10 in real time. Local history, cleanliness, and property values shaped by decades of industrial contraction. It's the visible aftermath of the survivor, the ghost, and the scar. As we leave the courthouse square and move into the neighborhoods, we see the human side of the story, the streets where the rise and fall of Marion wasn't just measured in jobs, but in lives. If you're finding value in this deep dive into Marion's history, hit the subscribe button and join us as we document the reality of the Rust Belt. If you have a story from these streets, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Now let's head into the neighborhoods. The grandeur of the courthouse square tells you what Marion was, but the neighborhoods tell you what it has become. Leaving the civic core, the scales shift from limestone monuments to wood and brick of the family homes. Downtown shows us the architecture of confidence, but the residential blocks show us the consequences of the decline. In the autopsy of this city, this is where the statistical fallout of industrial loss is finally calculated. We're moving from the symbols of prosperity to the reality of the human cost. Marion's neighborhoods were built in layers of prosperity. To the south and east, rows of worker cottages rose within walking distance of RCA and the Dana Gates. Homes built on the promise of 40 years of stable labor. In the mid-20th century, these were the pride of the working class. But today, these streets are the primary data points of our quality of life index. Safety is one of the clearest indicators of the pressure Marion's neighborhoods are under. Using FBA-style reporting, the U.S. violent crime average sits around 4 incidents per 1,000 residents. In Marion, that number is 10.2 per 1,000, more than double the national norm. Property crime tells the same story. The U.S. average is roughly 21 incidents per 1,000 residents, while Marion reports 33.9 per 1,000. Combined, the overall crime reaches 44.1 incidents per 1,000 residents, far above the national baseline. These aren't just statistics. They're the lived reality of neighborhoods that lost a stabilizing force of steady industrial employment. Affordability is one of Marion's few advantages. Housing costs are dramatically lower than the U.S. average. The overall cost of living there is nearly 1/3 cheaper. But affordability without opportunity becomes a trap. Cheap living paired with limited upward mobility. Graduation rates and proficiency scores trail national averages by wide margins. With lower performance and higher student-teacher ratios than the U.S. norm, the educational system reflects the same pressures seen across the city. Fewer resources, fewer families with stability, and fewer pathways upwards. Median household income in Marion sits far below the U.S. average, and nearly a quarter of its residents live below the poverty line, more than double the national rate. Adjusted for inflation, wages have barely moved in decades. Healthcare access is limited. Marion has fewer primary care providers per capita than the U.S. average, and health outcomes from chronic disease to life expectancy lag behind national benchmarks. When industry left, employer-based insurance left with it. With a shrinking tax base and rising vacancy, upkeep becomes a challenge. Empty lots, abandoned homes, and aging infrastructure create an environment that feels forgotten. Marion has fewer grocery options, fewer retail anchors, and fewer service sector jobs than the U.S. average. Food deserts and limited commercial gravity means residents often travel outside the city for basic needs. Many homes are over a century old, and roughly 1 in 5 is vacant, nearly triple the U.S. rate. In some neighborhoods, more than half the homes are rentals, many owned by out-of-county landlords. Infrastructure struggles under the weight of a shrinking population. Road conditions lag behind national standards. Public transit is limited, and broadband access trails U.S. averages. These are the quiet. Marion has parks and green space, but fewer recreational amenities per capita than the U.S. average. Limited youth programs and aging facilities reflect decades of budget cuts. Population decline, aging housing, rising vacancy, limited amenities, and economic distress all converge here. These neighborhoods are the human ledger of Marion's industrial collapse, the place where the survivor, the ghost, and the scar left their deepest marks. So as we move deeper into these residential streets, we can finally measure the full impact of Marion's rise and fall using our 10-pillar quality of life index and then comparing every category directly to U.S. averages, including FBI crime rates per 1,000 residents. We can now calculate exactly where this city stands today. This is the Going There, Doing That Quality of Life Index from Marion, Indiana. Here's how Marion stacks up. Safety comes in at 2 out of 10, the city's biggest weakness. Affordability is a bright spot with a 7, but education, the economy, and most quality of life categories land in the low threes. When we apply the full weighted system, the same one used for every city I cover, Marion ends up with a total weighted score of 375 out of 1,000. That gives Marion a final quality of life index score of 37.5 out of 100. That places the city in the critical category. And as always, to be transparent, these are the sources I use for this section of the video. Marion's story is complicated. A city shaped by industry, scarred by loss, and still searching for its next chapter. But every place I visit has people who care, who stay, and who keep pushing forward. That's true here too. Thanks for coming along with me on this one. If you found this breakdown helpful, feel free to subscribe or tap the bell so you don't miss the next city I cover. And if you've got a place you want me to visit, drop it in the comments. I always read them.